The Mishkan, or by extension the Beis HaMikdash, represents the entire experience of Judaism, how we connect with Hashem and how we bring Hashem into our lives, as the Torah famously tells us. In this week's parasha, we discover that there are two critical elements to the Mishkan. There is the Mishkan itself, and then the Aron, which is, according to the Ramban at least, the epicenter of the Mishkan. And those two elements, the Mishkan itself, or as the Rambam calls it, a place to serve Hashem through karbonos, and the Aron represent the two elements of Torah and Mitzvahs, and how that makes each of us into a home for Hashem, how those two sides of our avodah are critical to our connection. And Pasuk, commenting on the Pasuk that says, Vayas Betzalel es Aron, that Betzalel made the Aron, he said, Medrash, there's a very intriguing Midrash that says, B'shasham HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe asei HaMishkan, when Hashem told Moshe to make a Mishkan, so he came and instructed Betzalel, as Hashem had told him. Amaloi, so Betzalel says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Mahu HaMishkan Hazeh, what is the Mishkan? What's it all about? Amaloi, Moshe tells him, Shiasher HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shechinase B'soicha. It's a place where the Eibishter will manifest His presence. And Melamed Yisrael Torah, and it's also a place where Hashem will teach the Jewish people Torah. Amaloi Betzalel V'heichen HaTorah Nesuna. So Betzalel says to Moshe, so where's this Torah going to go? This Torah that we're supposed to teach. Amaloi, so Moshe Rabbeinu says, Mishono oisim es Mishkan. Once we make the structure of the Mishkan, then onu oisin ha'aron, we'll make an aron, and inside that we'll put the luchos, we'll put the, so to speak, the core of the whole Torah. Amaloi, so Betzalel says, Rabbeinu Moshe, ein kvoidesh haTorah bekach. It's not appropriate, it's not respectful to the Torah to do it in that fashion. And onu oisin ha'aron. First, let's make the aron to house the Torah, and then the building to house the aron. Because of this story, says the Medrash, Zacha Shikare al Shmoi, that's why the Mishkan is attributed to Betzalel, because of this foresight that he had, or at least the Aron is attributed. Shenemar, as the Pasuk says, Vayas Betzalel es ha'aron. It says specifically that Betzalel made the Aron. In other words, Mashma Medrash say, it would appear from the way the Medrash is saying it, Shetoichen inyan ha'aron hu dafan nifret mashras hashchina shebamishkan. That there are two separate things over here. There's the Mishkan, which is where you manifest Hashem's presence, and independently of that, there's the Aron, which is the place of Torah. And the same theme emerges from a different medrash, where the Eibishter says to the Yidden after they completed the Mishkan, he says, you've made a Mishkan which is a home for me. Now make an accommodation for my Torah that it could also be in proximity to me. So again, seems to make a distinction between the Mishkan on the whole and specifically the Torah. So it's a little difficult to understand this distinction. Of course, we understand that the place that represents Torah and that housed the Luchos was the Aron. But isn't the Aron also the main place of the manifestation of the divine Shechina, and the messaging to Moshe Rabbeinu came via the Aron? So why are we making this distinction? Look at how the Ramban says it. According to the Ramban, the entire purpose of a Mishkan is to have a place of divine presence, which is the Aron. So why are we separating them? So how can we make this split and say that the overall Mishkan and later the Beis HaMikdash is where the divine presence will be manifest? And then we make a distinction that the Aron is the place of Torah. Why? Why that distinction? So in order to understand why we're making these two areas of focus, the Mishkan for Hashras Hashchina and Torah, so to get that, let's first understand the message of the Mishkan. The Pasuk instructs us to make a place to house the divine presence, first in the Mishkan, later in the Beis HaMikdash. That's all Bakosiv in the Pasuk which says, Vasin in Migdash, V'shachanti b'soicham. Famously, make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell within you. As we well know, the Lashon is not as you would have expected. It doesn't say that Hashem will dwell in it, the space, but rather amongst you, the people. That illustrates to us that there's something additional besides just what you would expect, that this is a place of divine presence, and that is that not only is the building a place of divine presence, but every one of us is a place of divine presence. So we have to understand this principle of what does it mean that Hashem is within every single one of us. In order to do that, we're going to look at the end of the Gemara Chagiga. This is in fact a siyum on Gemara Chagiga, and we're going to look at two different opinions about exactly how it is or what's special about the Jewish people to the extent that we're actually immune from Gehenna. So Isa b'Gemara b'siyum Masechta Chagiga. The end of Masechta Chagiga, the Gemara tells us, Am Rabbi Abo, Am Rabbi Lazar, Tamid Chachamim eino shegehenem sheletes bohem. So first you have the opinion of Rabbi Abo that Tamidei Chachamim are immune to the fires of Gehenna. How do you know? Kal v'chomer is salamandra. It's a kal v'chomer from this creature, the salamander, which apparently is a creature that is born out of fire. Ma salamandra shetuldas eish he. Look at the salamander. It is born out of fire. Hasoch midamo ein urushaletes boy. If a person takes its blood and coats their skin with his blood, it's fire retardant. You'll be protected from fire. So therefore, how much more so Tamidei Chachamim shekol gufan eish? How much more so Tamidei Chachamim who are not the product of fire? Their entire being is fire. T'chsiv, as the pasuk says, Aloi koi dvarai k'eish num Hashem. Hashem says, my words are like fire, so they're filled with Hashem's words. So how much more so must they be protected from fire? If this little creature could have protection from fire, they certainly could have protection from the fires of Gehenna. So that's Rabbi Abahu, Tamidei Chachamim are protected. Rish Lakish takes it far further. He says, he says, the fires of Gehenna cannot harm even the sinners of Israel. How does he know? So we develop a kal v'chomer from the nature of the internal, the golden altar that was used inside the Beis HaMikdash that was coated in gold. If you have this wooden structure called the Mizbech Hazav, with the thinnest coating of gold on the outside, the thickness of a small coin, and yet for years and years and years of fire burning on it, it never burns. So how much more so, if that's the way it is, then the sinners of Israel who are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate is filled with seeds, Dichsiv, as the pasuk says in Shir Hashirim, pasuk says, like the pomegranate is your kind of your forehead, which we interpret to mean rakosech from the word reikanim, those who are empty. They look like they're empty, but they're actually filled with mitzvahs. Alachas kama v'chama, how much more so will they be protected? They also have their coating, so to speak, and not only a coating, but they're filled with mitzvahs. They'll certainly be safe from the fires of Gehenna. So it would seem that the link between these two statements, Rabbi Abo and Reish Lakish, is because what the Gemara was just talking about before that was the nature of the coatings of the two mizbachos and whether they conduct impurity or not. Mizbach Hazav and Choishes. So after he discussed that, Huva Memre Reish Lakish. So then it fits to talk about what Reish Lakish says in Israel, where he understands that we, even the sinners of Israel, have protection from the fires of Gehenna, learned from the gold of the Mizbech HaZahav, which we just spoke about in the Gemara. Where the part that he's emphasizing is that it was just a coating of gold that made this into the golden Mizbech. And because we were headed to that statement by Reish Lakish, the Gemara first preceded it with a statement of Rabbi Abo, quoting Rabbi Elazar, that Tamidei Chachamim are immune to the fires of Gehenna. Okay, so that would seem to be the link, but when you examine it, it's actually not a really good explanation. Aleph, question number 1. Imkain, let's say that is, in fact, because we were talking about the Mizbachos, and we were talking about the fact that they're coated, therefore we were going to the conversation of Reish Lakish about the coating of the Mizbech Hazav, representing the protection of every single Jew. So, then the logical step would have been, you've spoken about the Mizbachos, now quote Reish Lakish, who also speaks about the Mizbech Hazav, and then you can get into the conversation that there's another opinion that it's specifically referring to the Tamid Chachamim and has nothing to do with the Mizbech, which doesn't really have the same content as what the Gemara was talking about. So the order in which the Gemara presents the two opinions doesn't seem to be logical. Number 2, base ikra sugya oides poishi so b'shaychas l'shlitas hagehenim aleim v'oides hagehenim b'chlal u'b'masechta erevin. Here we're in Masechta Chagiga, suddenly talking about Gehenna and how it does or doesn't affect Jewish people. The truth is, this is a subject that is much more thoroughly discussed in the Gemara Erevin. And even there, they quote Reish Lakish with exactly what he's saying over here, that even the sinner is filled with mitzvahs like the pomegranate, and therefore we're protected from Gehenna. So over there in Erevin, where it spoke about this, that's where they should have quoted Rabbi Elazar, brought by Rabbi Abahu, that Tamid Chachamim and Orish Gehenna Shaletes Bohen Chole, that also Tamid Chachamim are protected from Gehenna. Shaharei Aleph Shamu Ikra Sugi Binyan Zeh, because that's actually where that's the focus of that particular section of the Gemara. So you should discuss all the angles. Whereas over here we're just quoting it as an aside because we were talking about the Mizbachos. So we're also talking about Reish Lakish's comment about the Mizbech, but Rabbi Elazar's comment really seems out of place over here. And second of all, Beis Masechta Erevin Kedemis the Masechta Chagiga. Erevin is an earlier Masechta than Chagiga. Usually you'd expect that you do a thorough treatment of a topic the first time you encounter it, rather than waiting for later. And then third thing we have to understand is Gimel B'divrei Reish Lakish. Let's look at what Reish Lakish actually says. He says we are protected, even the Poshe Yisrael, from Gehenna, because look, if the Mizbech Hazav is protected, how much more so? And his whole argument is because it's such a thin coat, and yet the fire doesn't penetrate through to the wood. Now, if you read the piece of the Gemara that led up to this, it seems that what Reish Lakish says over here is the exact opposite of what the Gemara there said, because the whole point of the Gemara and the conclusion of the Gemara over there was that it was a whole conversation about whether or not the Mizbeach could become Tomei, and the reason you think it could become Tomei is because it has a metallic outside, and the Rabbanan had to explain, we ignore the fact that it's a metal outside because that veneer is batel, it loses its status in the bigger picture of the Mizbeach. In other words, that seemed to diminish the value of the coating and speak about the value of the Mizbeach. Whereas Reish Lakish is saying the exact opposite. Look how strong the veneer is. So how does that fit in the Gemara? The Gemara's entire thrust was to say, look how irrelevant the coating is, because it's the Mizbeach that counts. Comes along Reish Lakish and says, look how powerful the coating is, because it protects the Mizbeach. To the point that he says, look, this little thin coating of gold protected the entire Mizbeach to keep it safe from fire. There are a whole string of other questions that we have to ask about how these two opinions are shared in the Gemara. We'll look at some of them. Aleph. Now, the logic of how we prove that the sinners of Israel are protected from Gehenna, because we learn it out of the gold of the Mizbech Hazav, it's a very strong and probably even stronger argument than the one for the Talmidei Chachamim. Because we say, look, he has gold. The gold actually protects from fire. So you could say, think about it. If this gold is enough to protect the sinners of Israel, for sure it protects the Talmidei Chachamim, because they have, so to speak, more of the gold. Maybe they did certain things that they shouldn't have, which maybe earn them the consequences of Gehenna. Don't worry about that, they're protected by the Torah. So it doesn't really actually make sense. Who needs to discuss a special proof of the fact that the Talmidei Chacham, and you surely thought of this as soon as you saw these two opinions. If you've already told me that the sinners of Israel are protected from Gehenna, why do you now have to prove to me that the sages are protected? It should be self-evident. It's a logical conclusion. If the sinners of Israel are protected from Gehenna, how much more so the Talmidei Chachamim? Also, once the Gemara already brought a very specific explanation according to Rabbi Elazar why Talmidei Chachamim, who are like the so-called salamander, are protected from Gehenna, so let's say you had to, for whatever reason, prove independently that the Talmidei Chachamim are immune to the fires of Gehenna. But why do you need a new Kal V'chomer from the salamander? Use the Kal V'chomer of the Mizbeach. Even if, for whatever reason, you have to prove it independently and you can't just extrapolate that Poisha Yisrael are protected from Gehenna. Okay, but use the same logic. The gold of the Mizbeach protects. Especially when you consider over Yossi Yuksha, it really makes no sense. Salamandra hu sheretz tomei oyal kol ponim chaya, the two versions of exactly what creature the salamander is. So either it's a sheretz, which is a fundamentally impure creature, or at the very least it's a chaya, but still a non-kosher creature. Mim kain. Why would we want to work out a concept, an appreciation for Talmidei Chachamim based on a non-kosher animal and possibly even an impure animal? When your alternative is you could have learnt it out of one of the holy items of the Beis HaMikdash. It doesn't make any sense. Another question doesn't make sense. Whichever way you look at it, somehow not only are the sinners in Gehenna, but the Torah scholars also in Gehenna. But somehow they're protected. So they are in Gehenna, but they're protected from the fires of Gehenna. One group is protected because of their Torah study. And the other group is protected because in spite of their rebellion, they are filled with mitzvahs. So why do we have such clearly different labels for them? They're two groups that are in Gehenna. They're two groups that are immune to get to the fire of Gehenna. Yeah, so each one for a different reason, but such dramatically different names. Torah scholars, sinners of Israel. In other words, there's quite a lot about this sugya that doesn't really seem to make sense. You can sail through it and say, oh, what a beautiful message, and share it at your Shabbos table. It's so beautiful that every single Jew has this aura of holiness that protects them. But what are we really trying to say over here? So what we're really trying to say is, there are two paths of connection between a Jewish person and Hashem. One is al yedei limud haTorah, the path specifically invested in Torah learning, and the other is al yedei kiyum hamitzvahs, specifically through observance of mitzvahs. But there is a distinction between the two paths. Obviously, you have to have both in your life, but as a primary path, depending which one you follow, there's a big difference. When a person learns Torah and therefore comes to use human intellect to appreciate and ingest divine wisdom, then that Jewish person becomes absolutely one with the Torah, as the Alter Rebbe famously tells us in Tanya, with an unprecedented kind of unity that doesn't exist in any other sphere, that you become absolutely one with the Torah that you're learning, which means that your reality, your definition of self becomes Torah. That's what you are. That's who you are. Whereas when a person does mitzvahs, so we know that at the time that you do the mitzvah, at that moment you are a vehicle for Hashem's will. At that moment in time, you are a tool that Hashem uses in order to fulfill His intentions. But there's nowhere that suggests that the person becomes bound up and one with the mitzvah in the same way as you do with the Torah. So now that we know that distinction, it's a very important distinction, we can come back to the two different views, Rabbi Elazar and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Elazar wants to describe what is unique about those people whose primary connection to Judaism is through Torah, Talmidei Chachamim. What's he say about them? So Reish Lakish says, Rabbi Elazar says, you know what happens to a Talmid Chacham when he learns Torah? His whole being becomes Torah, his whole being becomes fire. When we say fire, we mean Dvorai Ka'esh, the whole person, a Talmid Chacham, he is Torah. It's not that he learns Torah or he knows Torah, he is Torah. So that's Rabbi Elazar's focus, the value of Torah learning, the approach of Avodas Hashem through Torah. Whereas Reish Lakish talks about the greatness of mitzvah observance, even when it's done by a sinner. Where even the sinner is filled with mitzvahs like the seeds. Says Reish Lakish, the truth is that there isn't that same unity between the mitzvah and the person doing the mitzvah as there is in Torah. At least the person becomes a suitable container, a conduit, a vehicle for mitzvahs, to the point that he's filled with mitzvahs. And that has such power that it protects that person from Gehenna. And that's also why he's specifically associated with a pomegranate, because look at a pomegranate. The pomegranate is filled with seeds. But the shell and the seeds are actually quite distinct and separate. Which is illustrative of the sinners. They are people who do many, many, many mitzvahs. They're filled with mitzvahs. But they don't become the mitzvahs. You can still distinguish between the container, the human, and the mitzvahs inside. And they're just filled with mitzvahs. Now we see that there's a huge advantage to Talmidei Chachamim because they become the Torah itself. Still, you can't naturally say, okay, Talmidei Chachamim are far more advanced than Poisha Yisrael, because Talmidei Chachamim are one with the Torah, whereas Poisha Yisrael are only filled with Torah, with mitzvahs on the inside, but it doesn't become who they are. So naturally, you should think logically, if the Poisha Yisrael are protected from Gehenna, how much more so Talmidei Chachamim? Is not so simple. Because when a Talmid Chacham makes a mistake, it's a far more serious offense than if a lowly Jew had done it. As the expression goes, that even a mistake for a Talmid Chacham has the weight of a deliberate action by any other person. So you can't just derive from the story of the Poisha Yisrael to the Talmid Chacham, because they're judged at a higher level, and their things that they do wrong carry much more gravitas. And obviously we can't learn that because the Talmidei Chachamim are protected from Gehenna, the same should apply to Poisha Yisrael. That obviously we know you can't learn because the Talmidei Chachamim are absolutely one with the Torah, which you don't find to be the case of Poisha Yisrael. So we understand why you have to have two separate conversations, one with Rabbi Elazar, one with Reish Lakish, each giving a different motivation and explanation to how it is that their specific group that they're describing is protected from Gehenna. And with that, we get a very important insight into the difference of how Torah changes a person versus how mitzvahs affect a person. And with that, we can address the irony of the story, that the lesser people are compared to the holier item, the golden mizbeach, and the greater people, the Talmidei Chachamim, are compared to the non-kosher item, the salamander. Why did we do that? Because salamander, he told us, however it works zoologically, the salamander is a product of fire. That relates very well to the nature of how we're describing a Talmid Chacham, that they are fire. That is their reality. Their entire being is Torah. And in using this kal v'chomer to say here's a creature in the physical natural world that emerges out of fire and is therefore immune to fire, how much more so in the spiritual world of being an entity, a human, who is infused with fire to the point that becomes who they are, is certainly immune to some kind of negative spiritual fire. And using this particular kind of kal v'chomer, Rabbi Elazar also clarifies for us. Here you are talking about Talmidei Chachamim who are absolutely fire. In other words, they are completely one with the Torah. How then is it imaginable that they should sin? Why are they in Gehenna? It doesn't make any sense that a Talmid Chacham should land up in Gehenna. And on the other hand, if they are people who are susceptible to doing something wrong, which is why we're addressing what we do with them when they're in Gehenna, if they are susceptible, how are they immune to the fire? And they remain in that status of being, so to speak, completely fire. From that, we bring the example of the salamander, which is a product of fire. What does that mean? What's this got to do with it? Some big Gemara, the Gemara tells us that when it comes to the kashering of vessels, even though we know that you can take items to a mikveh as part of the purification process, the Gemara tells us that the primary way to immerse an object is actually in fire. Which means that by rights, fire purifies things even better than water does. So if this is true, that fire has the capacity to neutralize impurity, in other words, it removes the impurity, then logic will tell you if fire neutralizes, removes, sterilizes impurity, surely it cannot produce impurity. Nevertheless, you see that there's this creature which is not kosher, or according to some versions, a sheretz. It's an impure creature. She is sheretz tomei kol ponim chaya, and where does it come from? It comes from fire. And ironically, so it's fire which should get rid of impurity that produces an impure creature, and yet on the other hand, if you use the blood of the salamander as some kind of a bomb, it will protect you from fire. Now, if that's the story of this creature, that it was produced out of fire, which is a purifier, and yet became impure, and yet you could use it as protection against fire, how much more so Talmid Chacham, whose entire reality is fire, in other words, the entire reality is holiness. It's possible that a Talmid Chacham might actually slip spiritually at some point. It can happen. Why? Because the reality is that Talmid Chacham also lives in a physical body and also lives in a physical world, and is also dominated by people who have the wrong ideas and persuasions. Despite all of that, no matter what happens, they remain absolutely holy, to the point that they are protected from the fires of Gehenna. That's the message. So if fire produces a sheretz, you could still protect that person from fire. Whereas when Reish Lakish needs to illustrate to us that the sinners of Israel are still filled with mitzvahs like the pomegranate, for that he uses the example of the Mizbech, which is coated in gold. To illustrate that the mitzvahs don't transform the whole of us, they coat us in holiness. Which means that the person is now covered and held by a mitzvah which protects them. But as we already said before, it's not that you become absolutely one with the mitzvah. And that will also explain why we use such dramatically different titles for the two groups. The first group is called Tamidei Chachamim, and the second group are called the great sinners of Israel. If I'm talking about people who be'emes, the truth is that they are absolutely holy, they are completely enveloped in holiness. So even if they land up in Gehenna, you can't use words like sinner. You can't. They're absolutely holy. You're actually not allowed to do anything which might degrade them in any way, because as we know, if a person degrades a Talmid Chacham, they effectively are degrading the Torah. Because you actually cannot distinguish between the learner, the not just somebody who goes to a shir once a week, but a Talmid Chacham who is immersed in Torah learning. You can't distinguish between them and the Torah that they learn. As the Gemara tells us, that if a Talmid Chacham corrupts, you don't make a public spectacle of it, because that would be an insult to the Torah itself. Therefore, the Gemara says, and even when it's talking about a Talmid Chacham who's somehow messed up and therefore lands up in Gehenna, we still call him a Talmid Chacham. So at least you'll understand, it's a Talmid Chacham, but something went wrong. So it's a Talmid Chacham in Gehenna. You'll appreciate that we don't degrade the person, despise the person, but something happened to them and they belong in Gehenna, and we acknowledge that. Whereas on the other hand, Anoshim Pshutim, simple people, even when they are absolutely filled to the brim with mitzvahs, we can actually call them out and publicize their spiritual lack without insulting the mitzvahs. Because if I say that this person is a poisheya, I'm not saying that the mitzvahs have no value. All those mitzvahs are absolutely authentic. It just so happens that the nature of mitzvahs is they don't automatically transform the person to be duruch und duruch, completely successfully in a space of holiness. And you see that the Gemara actually goes specifically to speak of them in a degrading way. The sinners of Israel, which is not a nice thing to say. Why do we do that? Because we know from various places in the Torah that actually to degrade a person is sometimes part of their repatriation, of their teshuvah. Famous story where Chizkiah's father, Menashe, was this terrible idolater, and Chizkiah took his father's remains and schlepped them around the streets on ropes to dafka publicly embarrass his father's remains, to assist his father's neshama on its journey. Now, all of that was to bring us back to our conversation about how we're splitting the Mishkan and obviously subsequently the Beis HaMikdash into two realities. There is the Mishkan for divine presence, and then there's the place where you keep the Torah, and that's supposed to represent our Mikdash, where Asli Mikdash Shechanti B'Soicham, our Avodas Hashem, which has two areas, Torah and Avodas Hashem. So the fact that our sages pick up on the pasuk that says V'shachanti b'soicham, and they tell us b'soichoi loy nemar ela b'soicham b'soichol echad v'echad misro, that the Eibishter doesn't want just simply to reside in the Beis HaMikdash, but he wants to be within each of us. Move on. So that illustrates shekeshem sheb'mishkan haprati yeshnam shnei honyonim de Torah mitzvahs kach gam b'mishkan v'hamikdash hakloli. So we've just looked at the fact that there is Torah and mitzvahs, two completely different ways that we create a personal mishkan, a talmid chacham, or even somebody who's poisha Yisrael. So that must reflect back onto the mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, that they also must have two primary areas of focus. What are the two primary areas? Very famously, there's a debate between two of the great medieval scholars about what is the central purpose of the Mishkan and subsequent to the Beis HaMikdash. We already quoted the Ramban at the beginning of the Sikha. He says that the primary concept of the Mishkan is to have a place where the divine presence would be felt, and that's primarily in the Kodesh HaKadoshim and specifically in the Aron. And the Rambam's view is the primary focus of the Beis HaMikdash, and preceding that the Mishkan, is a place to be able to bring korbanos. Now, are they arguing? Not at all. They're giving us two angles and perspectives on what the whole Mishkan Beis HaMikdash reality is. Because the concept of Hashem's presence coming into the space has two parts to it. Aleph, one part of it is one part of it is that this is a place you go there, you see godliness, you feel godliness, it touches you in a personal way. You feel that you are one with Hashem in that space. That's the one element. Beis, the second element of the Mishkan and Beis HaMikdash is that's not just about my experience of godliness. It has to impact the physical, materialistic world that we live in. And how do you do that? Bring physical things into the avodah in the Mishkan and Beis HaMikdash, and you elevate them. This is actually pretty similar, obviously, to mitzvahs, which mitzvahs always have to be performed with physical items, right? You can't do mitzvah with just spirituality. You need to have a physical item. So in the same way, the Beis HaMikdash had to have these very physical things called korbanos. And these are represented by the two elements of the Beis HaMikdash. Aleph ha'aron. The aron represents the first thing, bringing godliness and creating an awareness of Hashem and feeling absolutely one with Hashem. And Beis HaKarbonis v'Mishkan bichlal, the karbonis and the rest of the structure, which is about bringing physical materials and incorporating them into the service of Hashem, like mitzvahs do. So Aleph ba'aron yinat Torah ha'isei elikus begoloi. When you deal with the aron, which is supposed to represent Torah, which is the process of creating an awareness of closeness to Hashem, that's where you see godliness. You look at the aron itself doesn't behave according to the laws of natural science. You looked at it and you could see that the space where the aron was is absolute godliness. Because only Hashem could accommodate absolute impossibilities. On the one hand, the Aron has very precise measurements, so it's very finite. And on the other hand, it takes up no space, which means it's completely beyond finite. That represents absolute oneness with Hashem, where you're completely outside of the world of rules and of the finite world, and that's achieved through Torah. Then Beis in avodas karbonis, and then you have the karbonis. And not just the karbonis, but the entire Mishkan, which is in Tilas Yud Gimel Tezvav Dorin Gashma Asiyas Mikdash L'Hashem Mehem, bringing all various kinds of materials and turning them from just being physical elements to become Hashem's home. That's where you bring the godliness down into the nitty-gritty of this world. Which is very similar to how we take physical items, use them to do mitzvahs, and as such we elevate those items to have a mitzvah holy value. Now you're going to say yes, but it's not as if there's a void in the Mishkan. The Mishkan also was a place of miracles and a place of divine revelation, and so were the Karbonis. There were miracles that occurred. It doesn't matter, even if you saw that the fire going up from the Mizbeach never moved in the wind, or was never doused by rain, or you saw that there were never flies. You didn't see the cow radiating Elokus. When you looked at the Aron, you saw it radiate Elokus. It doesn't fit into the laws of nature. At the same time that it's in nature, because it's measurable, you didn't see that in the Mishkan per se or in the Karbonos. Which is why the Midrashim we quoted at the beginning made a distinction between the Aron and the Mishkan. Even though, of course, the overall mission of the Mishkan and the Aron is a shared mission, bring godliness into the world. Because the truth is that there are two nuanced realities within that broader goal and objective. Aleph, the first thing is achsanya le'atzmi. The first thing that the Eibishter wants is that it should be a place where I can be accommodated. The Eibishter wants to come into the world. So how do you got to bring the world there. Bring the world, set it up in a particular way. And now Hashem says, okay, I'll be at home over here. I'll live in this space. And this kind of accommodation would be similar to what mitzvahs are able to achieve. That there's a connection. There's Eibishter in this world, and they're connected together. That our physical world should become an accommodation of Hashem. Then, then there's a separate concept to accommodate Torah, which means that's where there should be an awareness and experience of godliness as the Aron represents. Where you don't just see that Hashem touches or connects with or influences the space, but the space is absolutely one with Hashem. Where Hashem's presence and reality is so absolutely part and parcel of the Aron that look at it and you'll see it defies all rules and all logic. Which is very similar to the concept of a Talmid Chacham, where the Talmid Chacham himself becomes a fiery body. So now we've made this distinction between the effect of Torah learning and mitzvahs on the individual. I.e., the person who focuses primarily on learning Torah, the person who focuses primarily on doing mitzvahs. And we've said, we've also said that the same distinctions apply in the greater physical Beis HaMikdash. There's an Aron representing Torah, and there's the rest of the building and the Karbonos which represent mitzvahs. So the reason there are these two distinctions is because of the nature of what Torah is and the nature of what mitzvahs are and how they respectively represent connection to Hashem. We know that with regards to Torah, we say Torah and Torah and Hashem are absolutely one thing. It's the same entity. Not like two things that are bound together. Literally a single entity. Torah and Hashem is literally the same thing. Torah is Chachmasoi Yisbarach, and as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, Huva Chachmasei Echad, based on the Rambam, It's Hashem absolutely. V'la mitzvahs, shein rotzen ha'elyon, whereas mitzvahs, which express Hashem's will, they're nikru avrin de malka. They're considered like the limbs, Vayakhel of Hashem, 613 limbs. V'hem bedugma soivarim lemata, which is similar to human limbs. Shafal pi shem beteinem lenefesh. Obviously, your limbs are completely subservient to your neshama, and they have to behave as the neshama would want them to. Nobody would suggest that your limb is one with your soul. There's no delay in the soul's instructions and the limb's response, but you would never say that your limbs are your soul. Mitzvahs are an instruction from an instructor to an instructee, from Hashem to the Jewish people. Which is quite distinct from Torah. Whereas, Torah at the end of the day has value even before you learn it. The mitzvah has no value till you do it. So therefore, when you learn Torah, which is Hashem's infinite wisdom, which is absolutely one with Hashem, well, if you're learning something that is Hashem, naturally it's going to affect you that you'll become one with Hashem. But when a person follows Hashem's instructions by doing a mitzvah, where the whole intention of the mitzvah is the instruction to the person, obviously that causes the person to surrender their ego in the face of what Hashem wants. You put your interests aside, you do what Hashem wants. But you don't become one entity with the mitzvah that you have just performed. There's me who did that mitzvah. That would explain very well how come this concept of Hashem dwelling within us. Even if we're just looking at the part, which is to make the world into a place for Hashem to be accommodated and revealed. So we now understand you need to have both. You have to have Torah and mitzvahs because each one has a different effect. What is Hashem's intention in wanting to have a home in the lowest realm? It means Hashem wants His essence completely accessible here in the lowest realm. In the lowest of the lowest conceivable reality. Now you need two things to make this work. Number one, Aleph. You need Hashem's essence. So there's got to be a mechanism to access Hashem's essence. Number two, the second thing is you need a mechanism that brings that essence into the reality of this world, meaning to say you need a mechanism that is engaged with the realities of this world. That is the difference, but essentially the partnership between Torah and mitzvahs. Torah, by definition, is absolutely one with Hashem because that is what Torah is. That brings Hashem's essence into the space because I have a direct line to Hashem's essence. The Torah is one with Hashem. That doesn't bring it down into the physical world yet because I'm learning Torah, which is fairly abstract because it's an intellectual pursuit. It's not touching physical things yet. Because even when Torah is speaking the language of things that you and I could relate to, physical examples of scenarios, it's still not an actual physical item. Whereas on the other hand, mitzvahs that are considered like the so-called limbs of Hashem, the way that mitzvahs play out in this world is completely reliant on physical parameters. That's the whole point of mitzvahs. To take lowly physical items and to refine and elevate them by using them for mitzvahs. That's going to bring that essence that we connect with through Torah into the physical world. They work in tandem. Torah gives us access to Hashem's essence. Mitzvahs brings that essence down into real life. And that will better explain the connection between Rabbi Elazar and Reish Lakish. Where we see that they speak both about Talmidei Chachamim and Poshe Yisrael, to the sugya, which is what? Because remember, we asked, what's it got to do with this Gemara? It should be spoken about in Erevin. That's the main place we talk about Gehenna. And what's the connection to the Mizbeach that was just discussed before in the Gemara? Now we can start to piece it all together. The message of these two statements is, you have to pay attention to the details. And then you'll come to recognize that every single Jew, whether they be those who are in the upper classes of the great scholars, or all the way at the bottom of the barrel, the sinners, the Gemara just told us that the coating of the Mizbeach is not what you look at. You don't look at what meets the eye, but you look at what is the whole entity. The entity is a Mizbeach, therefore it cannot become impure. That's how you're supposed to look at a Jew. Yes, they might have a coating externally. You could claim they're hypocritical or whatever the case is. They're doing this. It doesn't matter. The entity, who is this person really? This person is holy. That's the direct follow-on from what the Gemara just spoke about, how it is that the two Mizbachos could never become impure. Why not? Because you look, this is the Shita of Beis Hillel, as we learned in the previous Sikha, that you have a look and you analyze what's going on over here, and you say the gold on the outside is there to serve the Mizbeach on the inside. So therefore, it's not the real them, the Mizbeach is the real them. The Mizbeach cannot become impure. And that's how a Jew is. The externalities, don't worry about that. It's who the person is on the inside. That's what really counts. Now that we've identified that the Mishkan represents both sides of how we serve Hashem, both Torah learning and Mitzvah observance, so therefore it's completely logical. After the Gemara discusses how it looks in the actual Beis HaMikdash, it discusses how it looks in the personal Beis HaMikdash. That just as in the structure, so in the person, you have two areas, Torah and Mitzvahs. So in one person, the Ikar is the Torah. In one person, the Ikar is the Mitzvahs. And the coating of Averos on the outside cannot harm them, because be'etzem, this is somebody connected to Hashem. Or if he's moving gam seder hadvarim, and finally that also helps us to understand why the order in which we confront Rabbi Elazar and then Reish Lakish, which seems to be the wrong order, actually makes perfect sense. First, the Gemara talks about Talmidei Chachamim, and only after that about sinners. Even though the Gemara is only really talking about the Mizbeach, and that only comes in the second statement, Reish Lakish's statement about the sinners, because the Gemara is telling us the reality is, under normal circumstances, this is how spiritual development works. First you learn, and the learn brings you to act. First you have to be a shtickle Talmud Chacham, and then that will help you to be able to be Melei Mitzvahs. And so it is in bringing godliness into whether it be our personal Beis HaMikdash or the broader Beis HaMikdash. The first and primary step of bringing Elokus into the world is through Torah. And then once we've introduced Hashem's essence into the space by learning Torah, then we ground that essence into our world by performing mitzvahs. And you have to have, therefore, both, although ideally that's the order that it goes. You learn, and as you learn, you connect more with Hashem, and then you translate that more into your world through the performance of mitzvahs. Please God, we should be zeicher to make a b'dirah v'sachtonim, both personally and in this world with the coming of Mashiach and the third Beis HaMikdash now.